Good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are we doing? How has your week been? Another 4-day week, right? We've kind of had a little bit of a run of them, if you could call 2 in a row a run of a 4-day week. So how's your week been? Let's just correct a couple of things because we're not doing women at work. We're actually doing, so this is the third third in the series on gender. So for the first week, so 2 weeks ago, if you listened in, I was talking about paternity leave. So I was really looking at gender equality from the lens of men. And what is it that men need, and what do I think would help to create a more gender balanced workplace with the interests of men at mind. And obviously, when I'm talking about men, I'm talking about people that identify as men, just to clarify. And then last week we talked about women. We talked about the great breakup and how women are leaving organizations. So that was the lens for last week, and what organizations could do about it. So if you haven't listened to either of those, please do go check those out. So today, what are we doing? So let me just recorrect that. We're looking at gender inclusion. Right, gender inclusion. So obviously I've talked about men's, kind of like rights and how we can further those. I've talked about women. We haven't really talked about gender non-conforming or gender non-binary or gender fluid. And so I wanted to kind of, just for the avoidance of doubt, make sure that we were covering all bases. And what we're going to be doing today, what I'm not going to be doing, I'm not going to be going through like a 101 of, sort of like gender non-conformity and what different gender identities are, etc., because there are many more people way more qualified than I am here on LinkedIn and on other platforms. And I will be directing you to some of those resources. But what I am going to be doing is I sense that there is a lot of noise out there at the moment about gender thinking, and I'm also not going to be talking about toilets and pronouns, right, for sure. But there is a lot of debate. There are lots of things happening in terms of laws, especially if you're in the US. There's a lot of change. And even here in the UK, there is a lot of conversation around, the definition of sex and all of those sorts of things, and sex rights and things like that. Some of which are, may or may not be helpful. And I don't want to, I'm not going to say that I'm sitting on the fence in this one, but what I'm doing is, one of my beliefs is that one of the key skills that leaders need currently in a very polarized and divided society is leaders need to be able to galvanize teams where there are differences of opinion. Okay, so where there are differences of opinion, different perspectives, and we're encouraging everybody to bring their full selves to work, right? But when your teams have got, far apart in terms of their understanding of something or their beliefs on something, how do you manage that? How do you create cohesion? How do you create a team where people feel like they belong? And actually, this is a really good topic, I think, for us to deep dive into, to understand what some of the challenges are around gender inclusion specifically. But also, really, let's get into some of the skills that you need when it comes to having these sorts of conversations with colleagues or team members, or if you're a manager or a leader and you have team members that identify as gender non-binary or gender fluid or some other gender non-conforming identity, or you're overhearing conversations amongst your team members. Because again, thinking about inclusion and inclusive cultures and creating an environment where people belong, the things that are said in workspaces, in offices, on Zoom calls, informally, all of those sorts of things go into creating an inclusive environment or not, as the case may be. So they can potentially create non-inclusive spaces. So that's why today I'm talking about the tricky topic of gender inclusion. Let's hope I don't regret this, right? And the way that I'm going to walk us through the conversation, as you can see there, so this is what we're going to cover. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think that there are similarities between what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the debate and the the backlash and things like homophobia and transphobia, I think we're seeing some similarities to what the gay rights movement has gone through over the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years plus, etc. And so I think it might be interesting to just compare some of those similarities, see whether there are any lessons we can learn from what that movement went through and where we are now in terms of what we do and don't understand, and the level of acceptance and tolerance, etc. And also let's see maybe where there are differences actually between the LGB rights and the T and the Q that usually comes after LG and B. Okay. And then I want to get into what do we know about this topic of gender inclusion, and what is there that we don't know. And I'm really going to be getting into some of the, as I say, some of the tricky, controversial bits. This is only like a 30-minute LinkedIn Live, right? So I'm not going to be able to cover everything because these topics are massive. And then finally, assuming and hopefully, you will want to learn more and find out more. So I'm going to finish off with resources. Where can you go if you want to find out more about this? Obviously, you can always contact me. But as I say, I am not the gender expert. I've done a lot of learning in this space because I actually find it quite fascinating. I'm actually wearing a t-shirt today that says gender, what a drag. And I've had it for a long time. It's from the Spark company. Whoever wants to know, somebody on Wednesday said something about my t-shirts with the various slogans. I get them from the Spark company. If anybody's seen me in these black t-shirts with slogans. So, all right, let's get into the conversation then. Gender inclusion. So let's start with the similarities to the LGBT rights movement. What I think is quite interesting, I'm going to start off with legislation. Those of you who are old enough in the UK may remember Section 28. So when I was a child, I think I'm going to say, was it 1977 or 78? I think Section 28 was brought in. Section 28 in the UK was banning of the promotion of homosexuality. So what that meant back in the late 70s and going into sort of like the early 80s, there was a ban on things like, talking about homosexuality in schools, etc., and things like that. And lo and behold, those of you that are, keeping abreast of what's going on in the States, what's happening stateside with the Republican Party, etc., particularly Ron DeSantis in Florida, and then there are some other states also as well. We're seeing the same thing, right, with specifically around gender non-conformity and sort of trans rights, but also actually going back into LGB rights as well. So not just questioning the whole sort of like gender conformity space or gender non-conformity, but also now almost like opening up some of the challenges around gay rights. So there's something around, I think the similarities, first of all, the legislation, so wanting to legislate against the unknown, things that we're not kind of sure about or that go against our norms, wanting to legislate against that. But also there's something about the precarious nature of these rights, which is something I've sort of stolen that phrase, I think, from the book The Patriarchs by Angela Saini. But the precarious nature of these rights sometimes, and I know in the US the fear at the winding back almost of gay rights, is a real thing, right? So legislation, and that moves nicely on actually to fear. So if you think about the gay rights movement, if you think back into like the 80s, 90s in particular, this fear of what's going to happen, this fear of, what's going to happen to our children, the fear of what's going to happen to society, is there going to be the breakdown of the breakdown literally of society, is it all going to kind of come crashing down? And I think we're sort of seeing a similar sort of mindset and fear around gender non-conformity, and this almost like this exploring the gender boundaries. We're seeing a similar level of fear, and then conflicting rights. So this is a really interesting one, and I think this is where there are most similarities, but there are also some differences that we'll get onto. But sometimes within the protected characteristics, and when we say protected characteristics, what we mean by that is parts of our identity that need to be protected from an equal rights perspective. So things like, our age, our ethnicity, our race, our gender, our beliefs, etc. Sometimes in those protected characteristics, you get rights that seemingly are conflicting. So, for example, when I think about the LGB rights and how that's moved, think back to a time when, especially when same-sex marriage was being legalized, and you had, for example, vicars and priests, for example, saying that because of their religious beliefs, they wanted an exception. They wanted to be able to say, I'm not going to marry a same-sex couple, right? So that's an example of like a conflicting right. And I think that some people now are sort of trying to say that we've got something similar. And I think there are some similarities. So if you think about, for example, the sort of gender critical movement, and that's a term for you that you might want to just like Google and look into. But there is this view that there are potentially conflicting rights with the rights of, for example, women, as in females, assigned at birth, and the rights of trans women. And I'm not going to get into that whole debate, but there is a view that there are rights that conflict, and I think that is where some of the clashing is coming from. We've also got some of the similarities with LGB rights: lack of science. And the reason is, we all know that the mind, right, is very difficult to kind of like analyze and get down. It's a lot easier to understand a broken leg and understand physiology and physical, sort of like changes and things that we can see, etc., rather than things that you can't see. And when it comes to matters of sexual orientation, gender identity, other things in terms of the way that we think, the way that we behave, feel, etc. A lot of that is very unknown, and actually, even from a sort of like medical perspective, far less money is put into neuroscience and the way that we work and why we do things. And I think, certainly in the LGB rights, I remember when I was growing up as a child, there being a lot of, views around, whether or not being gay was nature versus nurture. And the science on that has moved incredibly. And not only has the science moved, but actually, views have moved. And so that, that quote, that statement that I've put at the bottom, and this is according to the Pew Research Center, in 1977, only 13.13% of US adults thought that being gay was innate, as in, thought that it was down to genes or, something that happened in the womb or whatever it be. By 2022, it was over 50%. Right. So this is how sometimes things shift, and there is a lack of science, when we're sort of early on. And I kind of have a view that that's where we are with gender nonconformity. And if you think about things like, trans athletes, in sports, and gender dysphoria in particular. I remember sitting down a while ago at dinner, and I was sitting next to a clinical psychiatrist, and I was asking him about gender dysphoria and the science into it, and it's still quite far behind, right? So there is a lack of science in this area, and I think that leads to a lot of the controversy and a lot of the challenges. What are some of the differences, though, between gender nonconformity in terms of where we are and LGB rights? Well, social media, an explosion of social media. And there are certainly some theories around what social media has done. And the one that I've referred to at the bottom there is a hypothesis of social contagion. I'm going to leave you to look that up again. And I've said that it's a controversial hypothesis because some people feel that they have disproved it, and some people feel that the research to disprove it was ropey, right? So we've got this theory out there that some of what is driving gender nonconformity is social contagion rather than real sort of like gender dysphoria. And there is this talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria as well. So that is slightly different. The age of social media makes things slightly different. The conflicting rights, where I think that gender nonconformity is different to the example that I gave previously, is what we've got the proximity right, of the rights of those groups is much closer, and the harms overlap much more. And the reason, the term that I use there, harms, there is a brilliant book that I was recommended, which is called Sex is as Sex Does. And it talks about, looking at each instance where we need to think about the rights of, different gender identities, etc. And we've got some of those situations where the rights, so say, for example, I said I wasn't going to mention toilets, but let's talk about not just toilets, let's talk about changing rooms, actually. Let's talk about communal changing rooms in gyms and pools. You can start to see that the rights actually really start to butt up against each other. And I think that's one of the differences, and that's what creates sticking points. Obviously, nothing is unsolvable, right? And we just need a lot more creativity, a lot more respect when we're having those conversations. And I actually think we need lots more suggestions. We tend to move to very binary suggestions when we're discussing these things, right? So when we're discussing, for example, toilets, we go to either it should all be unisex or it should be single sex. There's other alternatives, right? So sometimes we get very binary when we're talking about what the potential options are, and I think sometimes that's what causes the conflict. One of the difference, though, is also with gay rights is the impact on minors, and there is a lot of debate on this. And if you were to look into transitioners versus detransitioners, and one of the resources that I'm going to suggest is Jubilee Media, which is a channel on YouTube that have some excellent content. But if you were to look at things like detransitioners of minors, etc., you'll see what all of the conversation is around that space. And that, I think, is very different to gay rights, right? Because the age of consent in terms of in terms of sex, I think I can say sex on LinkedIn, the age of consent for gay rights is the same, or at least now it is the same as it is for hetero relationships. But when it comes to gender nonconformity, it's different, right? So, and there are different factors around, should medical interventions be made, etc., for minors, who has the rights, should schools be able to overrule, wishes of parents, all sorts of things, quite complex. And I think that's very, very different to LGB rights in many respects. And I think that is one of the sticking points here. So definitive truth versus arguable truth. There's a brilliant definition that I'm going to borrow from a writer called Kate Borstein. I think that's how it's pronounced. From the book We Can Do Better Than This, which is a great book if you want to delve into LGBTQ plus identities and the stories and lived experience. It's a great book. So Kate Borstein has written a brilliant essay and talks about two types of truths. And this isn't something that that they've come up with. It's just, I just like the way that they phrase it. So definitive truths, two types of truths, right? Definitive truths, facts that have largely been verified and widely accepted, and then arguable truths, beliefs, views, and perspectives that some hold to be true while others do not, right? And we're going to talk about both of those. But what Kate says in the book is that often we end up battling with people over what really are arguable truths rather than definitive truths. So when it comes to gender inclusion, right, and this whole topic of gender nonconformity, what do we know? What are the definitive truths? So I've started with, I was going to call this bit, I've put beyond weird norms. I was going to say we are weird. We are weird, right? If you're watching this, you probably live in a country which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? That is what weird stands for. So if you haven't come across that, Google it, right? So, but gender beyond weird, the weird countries. There's a slide that I think I shared on LinkedIn a while ago. Gender beyond the binary. We all know that, and we this is without even talking about intersex. We all know that there are non-binary genders in other cultures that have been around for centuries. So the indigenous people in North America obviously talk about two-spirit cultures, two-spirit identities, rather, sorry. And then we've got in other countries, so in Mexico, you've got the mujer. Hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly. I'm possibly going to butcher some of these pronunciations, so apologies in advance. So the mujer, which is individuals who are born in a male's body but who identify as neither female nor male. And then you've got the secreta in Madagascar, which is boys in Sakalava communities who exhibit traditionally feminine behavioral personalities. You've got the Fa'afafine in Samoa, and also you've got the Kawajasara. Also, there's a term that is hijra, which is sometimes deemed to be offensive in a South Asian context, so to be used sparingly, or at least with that explanation. And then finally, in the classic Jewish text, the Talmud, there is reference to 4 additional genders beyond the binary, which are the Tumtum, androgynous, Saris, and Elonit. Apologies if I've butchered any of those pronunciations, but basically, outside of weird cultures, right, which obviously you've got the UK, US, etc., all of those, non-binary identities have been around for centuries, right? So this is, and that is truth. Okay, that is a definitive truth. If you were to, go to those cultures and look into the research, you will see that these identities exist. Social norms. Sometimes we hear this term, gender as a social construct, whatever, whether or not you do or don't agree with that term, but social norms, if you were to look at things like work, who went to work, who didn't go to work, fashion, what people wore, hair, makeup, and you were to maybe look over the last 400-500 years and even beyond, right? We would see that social norms change in terms of even if you were just looking at the binary, in terms of what a man or a woman would wear or do, or how they would present their appearance, social norms change over time. That I believe to be a definitive truth. Happy to be debated. Maybe somebody's going to tell me that it's an arguable truth, but social norms change over time, right? You only need to look at the pictures and the evidence. And then, the final thing in terms of definitive truth, Gen Z, certainly in these, in the sort of Anglophone countries, so in the US, UK, etc., Gen Z have flipped the script. And yes, I have spelled flipped with a T, because they really have turned things on their head, right? And it's not the norm. So most people under 40, certainly in the US and the UK, most people under 40, so that's your millennials and your Gen Z, see gender as a spectrum rather than binary. That is a fact. Whether or not you agree with them is completely different. But what I'm saying, and this stat has been moving this way for a while, right? Most people under 40 see gender as a spectrum rather than binary. So what is there that we don't know? What are the arguable truths? I've already talked about science, and I want to just mention specifically sport, because there is research and there is science. For trans athletes competing in the gender that they identify, and there is research and science against, and that is a really good example of, even where the science is, hasn't gone through yet enough peer review, hasn't been reconfirmed, studies haven't been kind of repeated and found to be robust, etc., all of those sorts of things, right? So a lot of the science is still very questionable. And what tends to happen, unfortunately, with debates like this, they are arguable truths, right? So depending on which side of the fence you sit on in terms of your views around gender and biology, you tend to grab for the science that kind of confirms your views, and this links into confirmation bias, right? So that's what we tend to do, and it's just sort of recognizing that. So when we, in the conversations that we're having with colleagues, with team members, etc., recognizing that happens, it's normal. Okay, we're humans, we tend to do that. We look for evidence that proves what we think, right? We look for evidence that proves our hypothesis. Social contagion one, I mentioned that one before. If you just Google gender identity, social contagion, you will see conflicting results coming through. You know, um, there is no consensus around whether what we're seeing in terms of the increase in gender nonconformity is social contagion, or whether actually is it just that, secondly, you know, people are more comfortable to you know, to express the fact that they identify as a different gender, or which is, you know, this kind of third hypothesis that I kind of carry, I'm going to call it the Cheryl hypothesis. Is it just that gender norms are just being thrown up in the air a little bit, you know? Like that's my view. My view is that the gender, you know, when I say Gen Z have flipped the script, I think flip the script, torn up the script, thrown it up in the air, whatever, you know, and I don't know where it's going to land, because I think at the moment things are still way up in the air, right? So those are some of the things. Biological discoveries. So you know, a lot of people say, well, biology is real. Yeah, once upon a time people thought the earth was flat. Right? So and don't get me wrong, I'm not sort of saying that all of a sudden that you know, that all of you know, sort of like biological sex science is going to be thrown out of the bin, right? But biological discoveries get made, don't they? Don't they? You know, and so that's what I'm saying. So finally, at the bottom, you know, beliefs on gender are very much influenced by political affiliation. If you were to look at the research that the Pew Center, it's a Pew Research Center in the US, and you look at views around gender identity and whether people believe that gender and sex are binary, it basically aligns pretty much to political party. If you're on the left, you tend to think of it as a spectrum. If you're on the right, you tend to think of it more as a binary. I think the other thing I would say also tends to align quite closely to your level of conservatism with a small c, and actually, you know, things like whether or not you have traditional views and or religious views, it probably tends to align quite strongly with that as well. So resources, where can you go? Apologies if you thought this was going to be like a gender nonconformity 101. As I say, I have done lots of research into this, but I am by no means the expert, right? So you have lots of LinkedIn voices on here who put out some amazing stuff. You know, one of my good contacts and colleagues, Katie Neves, in this space, trans ambassador. There's Max Siegel. There are other individuals who are probably too many to mention. AC Folks, who's recently got married, happy honeymoon. So lots of LinkedIn voices if you want to connect in with you know, individuals who are transgender or, you know this topic much more than me. That's where you can go. Some really good documentaries that I would recommend. So there is a National Geographic documentary called, I'm going to say, I think it's called Gender Revolution, from I think 2017. You can watch it free on, I think it's on their Facebook channel. It may be on YouTube as well. So it's a National Geographic one with Katie Couric called Gender Revolution, I believe. There is another documentary on Netflix called Transhood. Which, you know, talking to the point around the impact of this whole debate on minors. Transhood is a very good documentary to watch. It's a Netflix documentary. Books and videos. The book We Can Do Better Than This, I mentioned, which is, I think it's 2022, but it might be 2021. So it's quite current. Very, very good book. I think there is a book called Beyond the Binary as well, but I haven't yet read that one. Trans Like Me is an older book by C.N. Lester, but it's a book that I love, and again goes into the history of trans identities. So, you know, if you can't believe that these identities used to be around for a while, that might be an interesting book for you. And some of the videos, so obviously I mentioned Jubilee Media, their YouTube channel, anything around gender identity, sexual orientation, I would highly recommend. And also just how to disagree as resources, right? Because some of this is just learning the skills that you need to facilitate conversation and have good, I love debating with people. How do you learn to have good conversation, good robust conversations where you have a different point of view with somebody? Because that is part of getting along in a civilized society. And certainly, if we want to create organizations where people feel like they belong, we have to figure out how to disagree. The saying there at the bottom, we can disagree without being disagreeable, right? And we can also disagree without disrespecting another person's existence. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. I hope you found this useful. As I say, if this is a topic that you are struggling with in your organisation, please do reach out to me or one of the other experts that you can find here on LinkedIn. But certainly if you're struggling with how to deal with it, how to navigate these conversations, and you want somebody that's neutral, to kind of come in and talk about it. I'm quite blessed in a way. So my husband is actually is for many people that know, my husband is actually quite a religious man, and I am not, and so we hold quite different views on a lot of things, and I think that teaches me quite a lot in terms of how to navigate the world when you don't see eye to eye on everything, right? So if you want me to come in and speak specifically about that and how managers and leaders can manage teams and create that cohesion even when people have different views, please do drop me a DM. That's it. Hope that was useful. Please do go with grace and have a great weekend. Take care, guys. Bye.